Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we bring you stories that stir the soul and ignite deep reflection. Today, we have a story that touches on the complex issues of justice, accountability, and the unexpected heroes who rise in moments of adversity. It all begins with an elderly black man sitting peacefully in a park, only to find himself harassed by a young police officer. But just as the situation seems to spiral out of control, an unexpected figure steps in, the city's newly appointed police chief. What happens next will leave you both inspired and questioning how far we've come in the fight for equality. If you love stories that challenge your mind and pull at your heartstrings, make sure to leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an uplifting story from Hopeful Horizon. Let us know where you're listening from. Your support helps keep this community strong. The air was warm and still as Ian sat on the bench beneath an oak tree, the rustling leaves above, providing the only movement in the otherwise serene park. It was one of those rare, peaceful moments he cherished. Being an elderly man who had lived through many years of hardship and seen much change, he had learned to appreciate simple pleasures. His cane rested against the bench, and in his hands was a worn book of poetry he loved to read on quiet afternoons like this. The park had been his escape, a sanctuary where he could forget the noise of the world and enjoy the company of his thoughts. Birds chirped overhead, children played in the distance, and the sounds of a nearby fountain bubbled gently. Ian closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, letting the calm wash over him. But that peace was about to be shattered. A figure approached from the other side of the park, a young police officer fresh out of the academy, full of authority and a sense of duty that hadn't yet been tempered by experience. Officer Daniels was making his rounds, though there wasn't much to patrol in this quiet neighborhood. He had grown up in a nearby suburb, far removed from the diverse, bustling streets of the city. His experience with people like Ian was limited, and today he would make a choice that would change his life. Daniels spotted Ian sitting on the bench, alone, and for reasons that even he couldn't fully articulate, something about the scene didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the sight of an elderly black man alone in this predominantly white neighborhood. Or maybe it was his own subconscious biases bubbling to the surface. Whatever it was, he felt compelled to act. "Hey, you there!" Daniels called out, his voice breaking the tranquility of the park. Ian opened his eyes and turned to see the officer approaching, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you doing here?" Ian blinked, unsure how to respond to the strange question. "I'm just sitting, reading my book," he said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of wariness. Daniel stopped in front of the bench, his posture stiff. "This is a public park, sir. Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" Ian frowned. "Supposed to be here? It's a park, officer. Anyone can be here." Daniels crossed his arms, the tension in his stance becoming more apparent. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Ian was taken aback. "ID? For sitting in a park?" He hesitated, his instincts telling him this encounter was about more than just a routine check. "Just hand it over," Daniels insisted, his tone hardening. The peaceful atmosphere was gone, replaced by a growing sense of unease. A few people nearby had started to watch, sensing something was wrong. Ian slowly reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet. As he handed over his ID, he couldn't help but feel a familiar, sinking feeling in his gut. He had seen this before, different faces, different places, but the same cold suspicion directed at him for no reason other than the color of his skin. Daniels inspected the ID, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here alone? You live around here." "I've lived in this city my whole life," Ian replied, his voice steady but firm. "This park belongs to me as much as anyone else." Daniels wasn't satisfied. He radioed in, asking for a background check, even though there was no real cause for concern. Ian sat silently, gripping his cane a little tighter, frustration building within him. He had done nothing wrong. He was just a man trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon in the park, but here he was, treated like a suspect. In the distance, someone was watching. Chief Kevin stood leaning against a tree, his face unreadable as he observed the situation unfolding before him. He had been walking through the park, enjoying a break from his duties, when he saw Officer Daniels approach Ian. Something about the scene had immediately caught his attention. The aggressive posture, the unnecessary questioning, it was all too familiar to him. Kevin had worked his way up through the ranks, and he knew the kind of unchecked power young officers could sometimes wield when they thought no one was watching. Kevin watched as Daniels continued to press Ian, the elderly man's patience visibly wearing thin. But Kevin didn't intervene just yet. He wanted to see how far this would go, and it was about to go too far. "Stand up," Daniels ordered suddenly, stepping back and motioning for Ian to rise. "I need to search you." Ian's eyes widened in disbelief. "Search me? For what? I haven't done anything wrong." "Just stand up," Daniels barked, his hand moving toward his holster as if ready to escalate at the slightest provocation. Ian slowly stood, leaning heavily on his cane. His heart raced, anger now mixing with fear. He had done nothing to warrant this kind of treatment, yet here he was, being humiliated in front of strangers for simply existing in a public space. The onlookers were whispering now, their curiosity growing as the situation became more tense. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Others exchanged uneasy glances, but did nothing to intervene. It was then that Kevin decided to step in. "That's enough, Officer Daniels," came a calm but authoritative voice from behind them. Daniels turned, surprised to see the tall, imposing figure of Chief Kevin approaching. The onlookers gasped, recognizing the new police chief, who had been making waves in the city for his tough stance on accountability within the force. Daniels froze, his face flushing as Kevin approached, his eyes locked on the younger officer. "What do you think you're doing?" The tension was palpable. Kevin stood between Ian and Officer Daniels, his presence alone causing the air to shift. Ian, still clutching his cane, breathed a sigh of relief, though his heart continued to race. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but at least now, someone was standing up for him. Officer Daniels stiffened under the gaze of Chief Kevin. He hadn't expected his superior to witness this routine check, let alone intervene in it. He opened his mouth to explain himself, but was cut off by the firm authority in Kevin's voice. "Why are you harassing this man?" Kevin asked, his tone calm but unyielding. He didn't raise his voice, but every word carried weight. Daniels faltered, his bravado crumbling under the chief's gaze. I thought he looked suspicious. I was just doing my job." Kevin's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to protect and serve, officer. What exactly did you find suspicious about a man peacefully sitting in a park?" Daniels swallowed, struggling to find an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further. His hand drifted away from his holster, but his defensive posture remained. "He didn't respond the way I expected, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay." Kevin shook his head, disappointment clear on his face. "This man is sitting, minding his own business, and because he didn't respond the way you expected, you decided to treat him like a criminal?" Ian, standing just behind Kevin, felt his grip on his cane loosen slightly. The chief's words were like a balm to his frayed nerves, but the humiliation of the situation still stung. Kevin turned to Ian, his expression softening. "Sir, I'm deeply sorry for this." His voice was sincere, and for the first time in a long while, Ian felt seen. "It's not right," Ian replied quietly, his voice filled with years of accumulated frustration. "This happens too often. I've lived here all my life, and yet I'm treated like an outsider." Kevin nodded gravely. "I understand, and I assure you this isn't how things should be." He turned back to Daniels. "I'm going to need your badge and gun, officer." Daniels' face paled. "But, Chief, I didn't mean—" "You made a choice today," Kevin interrupted, his tone firm but controlled. "And that choice has consequences. You don't get to hide behind your badge when you act outside the law." For a moment, it looked like Daniels might protest, but then he saw the crowd. The onlookers had grown in number, their phones recording every second. The weight of public accountability loomed over him, and with shaking hands, Daniels unhooked his badge and handed it over. Kevin took the badge and gun, stepping back from the officer. "I'll be dealing with you later," he said coolly. "For now, I suggest you leave the park." Daniels gave a stiff nod, avoiding the eyes of those watching, and walked away in defeat. The once confident officer now seemed small and broken, disappearing through the park's entrance. As the officer retreated, the murmurs among the onlookers grew louder, a mix of astonishment and approval spreading through the crowd. Kevin, with his back to them, turned his attention back to Ian. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern in his eyes. Kevin could see the strain this encounter had placed on the older man. Ian nodded slowly, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "I've had worse," Ian replied, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But this was different. You don't expect to come to the park for peace and leave feeling like a criminal." Kevin sighed. "I can't undo what just happened, but I can promise you I'll be making changes. That kind of behavior won't be tolerated under my watch." For the first time since the ordeal began, Ian smiled faintly. "You're different from the others," he said. "Most would have turned a blind eye. You didn't." Kevin looked Ian directly in the eyes. "I didn't get into this job to turn a blind eye. Too many people have already done that, and look where it's gotten us." The words struck a chord with Ian, who had seen the city go through various phases of leadership, some good, some terrible, but few who truly seemed to care about real change. Before either man could say more, a woman from the crowd stepped forward. She was holding her phone, her face flushed with emotion. "That was amazing," she said, addressing Kevin. "I recorded the whole thing. People need to see this." Kevin raised a hand, stopping her. "I appreciate that, but this isn't about me. It's about accountability, and it's about the respect that every person in this community deserves." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Still, people need to know what's happening out here." Kevin didn't argue. He understood the power of social media and how quickly stories like this could spread. If it sparked a larger conversation, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The crowd began to disperse, and soon it was just Kevin and Ian standing under the shade of the oak tree. Kevin walked Ian to his car, taking time to listen to the older man talk about his life in the city, about the struggles he had faced, the progress he had hoped to see, and the many times he had been disappointed by those in power. As they reached Ian's car, the elderly man turned to Kevin and extended his hand. "Thank you, Chief, for everything." Kevin shook his hand firmly. "No need to thank me. I'm just doing my job the way it should be done." Ian smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "I believe you, and I hope there are more like you out there." Kevin nodded. "I'm working on it." With that, Ian got into his car and drove away, leaving Kevin standing alone in the parking lot. The park was quiet again, the earlier tension now just a memory, but Kevin knew this moment would leave a lasting impact. The events in the park that day didn't remain a private affair for long. The video of the confrontation between Officer Daniels and Ian went viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. People from all over the city, and even beyond, shared and commented on the incident, sparking debates about racism, police conduct, and the need for reform. Kevin found himself in the center of a growing movement. While he hadn't sought the spotlight, he knew the attention this brought could be a turning point for the city. More importantly, it could be a turning point for the police force he now led. The video spread across platforms with astonishing speed, gaining traction not only in their city, but across the country. It was picked up by news outlets, commentators, and social justice advocates who called for deeper discussions on systemic racism within law enforcement. For many, the video was a reminder of the everyday battles faced by Black Americans, and for others, it was a stark wake-up call. As the news swirled, Chief Kevin's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from local leaders, community organizers, and even higher-ups in city government. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Some were in full support, while others, including the city's police union, were less thrilled. The local news anchor framed it as the park incident, though Kevin found it absurd to reduce such an emotional moment to a soundbite. He hated that the event had to be given a name in the first place. Despite the media circus, Kevin knew the real work had to begin within the department. The police force had always had a complicated history with race, much like many others in the country. But Kevin saw this moment as an opportunity to finally address what had been swept under the rug for far too long. He wasn't just going to settle for a single officer's resignation. Kevin called an emergency meeting with his officers the day after the video went viral. The atmosphere was tense as dozens of officers filed into the precinct's conference room, many of them murmuring in low voices. Some stared at Kevin with resentment, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Kevin stood at the front of the room, his jaw set, waiting for silence to fall. When it did, he scanned the room, meeting each officer's eyes one by one before he spoke. "By now, I'm sure you've all seen the video of what happened in the park," Kevin began, his voice steady. "What we saw was unacceptable, plain and simple." A murmur spread through the crowd, and Kevin held up a hand to silence it. "I won't tolerate racism or discrimination in this department," Kevin continued. "What happened was not just a public relations issue, it was a failure of our values. This force exists to serve and protect everyone in our community, not just the people you feel comfortable with." One officer raised his hand from the back of the room. "Chief, don't you think this has been blown out of proportion? Daniels was just doing his job." Kevin turned his gaze to the officer, his expression unwavering. "If you think what Daniels did was part of the job, then you don't understand the job." The room fell silent again. The job is about respect, integrity, and justice. It's about protecting the people who trust us with their safety. If you don't believe that, you have no place in this department. He let his words sink in. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in quiet agreement. "I'm not asking for perfection," Kevin continued, "but I am demanding accountability. From this moment on, we will be retraining our entire force in de-escalation tactics, cultural sensitivity, and community relations. This isn't just about one officer, it's about all of us." The announcement wasn't met with applause, but Kevin didn't expect it to be. He knew change wouldn't come easy, but it had to start somewhere. As the meeting concluded, Kevin saw a few officers linger behind, their faces troubled but thoughtful. A younger officer, Williams, approached Kevin before heading out. "Chief," he said, his voice low, "I just want you to know I'm with you on this. Things need to change. I've seen stuff here that doesn't sit right with me. If there's anything I can do, let me know." Kevin offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Williams. We need more people like you." Williams nodded, his shoulders straightening with resolve as he left the room. It was a small victory, but for Kevin, it was a sign that the tide was beginning to turn. A week after the incident in the park, Ian found himself reluctant to leave his home. The ordeal had left him shaken, and the thought of returning to the same park filled him with a quiet dread. Despite the public outcry in his favor, Ian didn't feel like a hero. He just wanted to be left alone, to sit in his usual spot under the oak tree without fearing another confrontation. But something had changed in the city, something he hadn't anticipated. One morning, as Ian sat in his living room sipping coffee, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" Ian said cautiously. "Ian, it's Kevin, the police chief. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Ian's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Chief Kevin? No, you're not disturbing me. What's this about?" "I wanted to apologize again for what happened last week," Kevin said, his tone genuine. "But more than that, I'd like to invite you to speak at a community forum we're holding. It's about police reform, and I think your voice would make a real difference." Ian was silent for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. "Me? I don't know if I'm the right person for that, Chief. I'm just a man who had a bad run-in with a cop." "That's exactly why we need you, Ian," Kevin replied. "You represent the people this reform is supposed to help. If you speak, people will listen." Ian hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the thought of standing in front of a crowd made his palms sweat. But then he thought about all the other people in the city, people who, like him, had been mistreated or ignored. Maybe, just maybe, his story could help change that. "I'll think about it," Ian said finally. "That's all I ask," Kevin said with a smile in his voice. "And no pressure. If you decide not to, that's okay too." On the day of the forum, the community center was packed with people from all walks of life. City officials, police officers, activists, and regular citizens crowded the room, eager to hear the discussions on reform and accountability. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Ian sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together. He hadn't decided whether he'd speak or not, but Kevin had made sure to save him a spot near the microphone just in case. Kevin took the stage first, addressing the crowd with his usual calm confidence. "We're here today because we recognize that change is needed. Our city has a responsibility to every citizen, and that includes making sure our police force operates with fairness and respect." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Kevin's gaze swept the room before landing on Ian. "Ian," Kevin said, "would you like to say a few words?" Ian's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he considered shaking his head, staying silent. But then he thought about everything he had been through, about the countless people who had experienced the same, or worse, and never had the chance to speak. With a deep breath, Ian stood up and walked to the microphone. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "I'm not much of a speaker," Ian began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But I do know what it feels like to be treated as less than human. And I know that it has to stop. We all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who we are, no matter what we look like." As Ian spoke, the crowd listened intently, and Kevin smiled from the side of the stage. This wasn't just the end of one man's story. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The ripple of change had begun. Months after the incident in the park, the city had begun to see real changes. Kevin's reforms had taken root, and the police force was undergoing a transformation. Officers were required to undergo regular training in de-escalation and cultural sensitivity, and community engagement programs had been launched to rebuild trust between the police and the citizens. Ian had become an unexpected advocate for police reform, speaking at various events and sharing his story in an effort to inspire others. Though he had never asked for the spotlight, he used it to make a difference. As for Officer Daniels, his resignation was accepted, and though the department had faced backlash from some who supported him, the majority of the city rallied behind Kevin's vision for a more just and accountable force. The park, once a place of tension for Ian, had become a symbol of hope. He returned there often, sitting under the oak tree with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, the city felt like it was moving in the right direction. And for Ian, that was enough. Thank you for joining us on this impactful journey of justice, accountability, and change. Ian's story reminds us that even in the face of injustice, courage and integrity can make all the difference. It's about standing up against discrimination, even when the challenges feel insurmountable, and never losing sight of the need for equality and respect. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another powerful story from Hopeful Horizon. We'll be back soon with more tales that inspire, challenge, and stay with you long after they're told. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay strong, and always fight for what's right.